so people will sort of have a roadmap of what we're doing. But so good morning. Really nice to see so many of our colleagues and friends this morning. This is a session in our series for our teachers and their students, which we're so thrilled to be funded to do through CJP this year. And I think I saw Beth, is her name maybe, from or Debbie, someone from CJP is joining us who wanted to be with us today. So happy to have her with us. Good morning, Alana, nice to see you. And what we've been doing during these sessions is providing some sort of space, not some sort of, just providing a space for predominantly our colleagues who work in the synagogue and part-time school setting to share content that they may want to apply in their settings, but also to be in a community of like-minded educators to support each other during these distance times. And it's really nice to have heard this morning at the little bit of schmoozing that we did around the vaccine. So we know that the end is really coming around the bend. And it's nice to see Jonathan smiling about that. So I'm really thrilled this morning that we've been able to invite in two dear colleagues whose work is so close and so important to the work that we all do, Jonathan Krasner and Sarah Bunin Benor. Jonathan may be familiar to many of our Boston friends. Jonathan is at Brandeis and he is the Jack Joseph and Morton, of course, and Morton Mandel Professor of Jewish Education at the Mandel Center for the Studies in Jewish Education at Brandeis. Really are close colleagues and compatriots just up the 128 at Waltham, even though we're all just sitting in our bedrooms and living rooms right now. So Jonathan, so happy to have you with us. And Sarah from HUC in LA. And we're so thrilled to have you with us as well this morning. Both of you obviously working deeply in the arena that we all work in. And I say, oh, Rivka Good is here. That's so nice. So many of you may know that Jonathan and Sarah are the authors of this book, which won the Jewish Book Award this year, Hebrew Infusion, and their research took them into Jewish camps. And they studied the infusion approach that, or we all know that camps take in infusing Hebrew into their worlds. And so many of us try to apply a lot of what that work is into our own settings. And we'll have an opportunity this morning to hear from Jonathan and Sarah as they share their research with us and then think about the implications and the applications in our setting. So we're really excited about that. And it's great to have everybody here this morning. So as we get started, I want to do a few things. First and foremost, hi Rivka, nice to see you. Please, can everybody change their name to their first name and their school? Whether, and you don't have to put like the whole whatever big name, but just say, congregational synagogue or whatever, just so that Sarah and Jonathan have a sense of who is in the room with us today. And then while you're doing that technical thing, just to get us in the mood of camp and to sort of focus us on camp, I would love for everybody in the chat, or we may even have a minute since it's it's a smallish group, think about one Hebrew word that evokes for you Hebrew infusion in camps. So if anyone wants to pop in with that, either in the chat or verbally, that would be beautiful. A word, a song.
Hakshivu, hakshivu na.
Rav Todot, Susie.
Tom.
Like, wait, Janice, what kind of Tom?
Flavor.
Oh, Tom. Okay. I was hearing
Excuse
it as,
me.
Yeah, I was hearing it as Tom, modest, no. Quiet.
That's your Pesach talking. That's your Pesach talking.
Good. I see Ruach, Hadarochel, Moadon. Fabulous, fabulous. Any other Hadarochel? Beit Am. Okay, great. So just to get us a little bit in the mood, if you saw in our Boston group, I put in the WhatsApp group last night a link to a little promo video that Brandeis put together about the book and the study. So I'll put that in the chat momentarily. So also if you want to sort of jazz yourself up thinking about what this work is all about, that little promo video does a good job doing that. So thanks to everyone for being here. Good to see you. I'm going to turn it over to Michael to do a short activity, and then we will turn it to Jonathan and Sarah.
Great, thanks, Marion. Morning, everybody. Lovely to see everyone here. I think we're all getting excited about what Jonathan and Sarah can share, but we always like to start with a little bit of a kavanah for us, a time just for us to reflect on ourselves and where we are in our work. So we'll just take a few moments just to do that together, a little exercise. So you're going to need a piece of paper and a pencil or a pen. If you could just have that nearby, ready to go, that would be helpful. So we've spent the entire year, as we know, pretty much doing this work online, and we've all had some isolation, and it's been tough, as we know, and we're about to hopefully launch into coming back in, which kind of is reflected of our Torah portions as we move into the coming back from the affliction of our plague back into the community and all of the rituals that it takes to re-enter the community and be part of the community again. And that's very much really something that we'll be needing to think about as we come back into the open and back with our people, back into our communities in presence. But before we do that, I think it's important to take a moment to reflect on the experience we've had, because there's no point going straight back into the world that it was without even reflecting a little bit on the notion of what it's been to be in the situation we have been. So I want to do what's called the 1-minute exercise. You may have done this before. It's a prompt. I'll give you a prompt. I'm going to give you exactly 1 minute to write, which means that you can't think about it. Just write whatever comes. Don't, in fact, thinking about it will stop you. So just write whatever comes. This is just for you. You're not sharing it necessarily with anyone else. So it's a 1 minute prompt. There are 3 of them, so we'll do one after another. And it's an opportunity just to do some reflection, some kavanah for the experience of the last year, particularly in our roles, and paying attention to some of the things that may not have been stimulated over the year because we have been so isolated. What does it mean for us to reflect on these and to take with us perhaps a new way of thinking as we move into the real world again? So the first prompt for 1 minute, which Marion is also going to put into the chat. Over this past year, what I noticed about myself was, over this past year, what I noticed about myself was, right now. Okay, stop writing. Think about what you've written, perhaps underline or circle words that seem to stand out, words that have meaning, that seem to be important in what you've written. Make a note of those words. And we're going to move on to the second prompt. So Here's the second prompt for you. Over the past year, what I've noticed about my teaching is, over the past year, what I have noticed about my teaching is right now. Okay, stop writing. And also look at that and think about the words that stand out in that paragraph. What's important, what seems to be meaningful? Is there any connection to what you wrote before? Circle or underline any of those words. And we'll go to the third prompt. Over this past year, what I noticed about my imagination is, over this past year, what I noticed about my imagination is. Okay, stop writing and reflect on that and mark or circle any of the words there that seem to stand out, that have an importance in your thinking and your reflections. So that's the exercise. That's an opportunity for us to reflect, think about. Would love to, if you want to share any of those keywords in the chat, any of the keywords that seem to stand out, or phrases that seem to be important. But mostly for yourselves is to think about the notion of who we are in this past year, what's been happening to us, our teaching, and to our imagination, so that we come out of this experience refreshed and renewed, and we don't just carry on as we were, perhaps feeling exhausted and tired and drained, but rather open to the world of possibilities, having learned perhaps as much as we can about ourselves as we go. So we have Beth saying more patience with co-workers, Susie saying face-to-face relationships, imagination as the core element of teaching, coping with challenges.
Michael.
Ilana. Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, like, more generally for me than the words, it was the opposites. So when you asked us about I discovered I am, there were a lot of like, I stress too much or whatever, but on the opposite side, when you talked about teaching and imagination, there were lots of opposing words like flexibility, creativity. So it was really interesting to see how they played against each other.
Right. So we're living with that conflict and how to heighten part of what we want to do when we go back, and what we want to play up, if you like, foreground for us. So other things we've got: problem solving, space and time, less patience with Hebrew students and lack of involvement with parents, reimagine what it means to build and to be in community, building connections with students, so important. We need to remember how important that the building connections is. We've done that so well, all of us, and this is part of what this exercise is all about, and can't forget that when we get back into the classroom. My creativity has been starved, the energy I've been using to keep things afloat, yes, and how to be aware of that. So we're not just in survival mode, but we're in a mode of our imagination working again, creating more engaging programs for students and parents together rather than just the students. What a great revelation. We heard that from David Breithman last time we met. I agree, Janice. And yeah, so everyone likes what Janice has to say. So thank you for that, Kavanagh, that opportunity just to reflect this morning. And I don't want to take any further time from Jonathan and Sarah. So it's wonderful to just to share that moment with you and be with you on this journey as we move forward. Back to you, Marianne.
Thank you so much, Michael, and thank you, everybody. I hope that really was a helpful grounding and also an opening for us to listen to Jonathan and Sarah with an eye towards our coming creativity and the coming opening that we'll be having, both internally, an opening of ourselves, and physically opening, obviously, of our spaces. So thank you, Michael, for that. And Jonathan and Sarah, I am going to turn this over to you. I think I'm going to check if I need to make you hosts or whatever, but go ahead. I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan.
I think we're able to share screens, or at
Fantastic.
least I'm able to share my screen. First of all, thank you both very, very much. It's wonderful to be here. It's always wonderful to be with our colleagues from Hebrew College, Marian and Michael, and it's wonderful to see some familiar faces as well as some faces that I haven't met before. And Sarah and I are both delighted to be here to talk a little bit about our book and to talk a little bit about some of the new research that Sarah is doing on Hebrew in congregational schools. So before we talk about the congregational schools, I think what Sarah and I decided is that we'd spend the first few minutes just giving you a little bit of a taste for our book and for the research on camping. And I'm going to do that. And then Sarah is going to jump into some of the new research that Sarah's doing with colleagues, with a colleague on Hebrew in supplementary schools. So I'm going to share my screen. And let's see. Can you see my screen? Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so I learned from a colleague of mine, Kathy Simon, that you don't necessarily have to go into the mode where you can have your little pictures on the side. And that's okay, that as long as people can see. So hopefully you can see. The reason why I'd like to keep these open is just in case for the purposes of time that we need to skip around a little bit. Let me say first a little bit of an introduction about our study itself. First of all, this is a book that was written by 3 scholars, myself and Sarah are here today, but our colleague Sharon Avni was also integral to the research and writing of this book. She is at CUNY and she is an expert on language and education and has done a lot of work on Hebrew. So you may have seen some of her work before. And of course, a book like this couldn't be possible without funding from a variety of sources. And we always like to acknowledge the help that we've received, not only from our home institutions of Brandeis and HUC, but also from CASG, the Consortium of Applied Studies on Jewish Education, and from the Wexner Foundation. So as I think that Marianne sort of intimated before, our research really focuses on camps. It was conducted between 2012 and and 15. There were really two prongs to our research. We visited about 36 camps. We surveyed camp directors. We got a 64% response rate, which those of you that have gone into the field with surveys before know that that's a pretty healthy response rate. We observed trainings. We conducted interviews with directors and staff. We did focus groups with campers and alumni. And we also conducted historical research in archives and interviewed historical people historically who were involved in summer camps in the past. The camps that we looked at were really across the United States. You can see that they're clustered mostly in the Northeast and in the far West. Although we also hit North Carolina, we hit Jacobs Camp in Mississippi. We were out in Colorado at Ramah. We were at a few camps in Wisconsin and Washington State. So, and we also tried to we got up to Canada as well. So we tried to give a geographically diverse picture of what's going on at these camps. And we also tried to we tried to hit all of the different types of camp. We wanted a representative sample, and you can see here, I'm not gonna read the entire slide to you, but you could see that we were at movement camps, we were at Zionist camps, we were at pluralistic camps or JCC camps. We even went to a Sephardic camp, a camp that caters primarily to Jews of color, and we even got into some ultra-Orthodox camps as well. A couple of definitions first in terms of understanding what we're talking about. So rather than talk about camps as places that either have Hebrew or don't have Hebrew, what we found is that virtually all camps have some Hebrew, and that what we really need to talk about is a continuum of Hebrew richness. So what we found from our study is that on the, let's say, lower end of richness, you find private camps, independent camps, JCC camps, and then the further along the continuum of richness you go, you get to the movement camps, you get to the Zionist camps, and finally, you get to a few camps that were historically Hebrew-speaking camps, like Camp Yavne here in New England, and of course Camp Masad, which we have Camp Masad in the Poconos, which is no longer with us, but we also have Camp Masad up in Canada that is still alive and well. And these are camps that are specifically dedicated to Hebrew speaking. So we have this continuum of richness. I should say, by the way, that of course there are exceptions to this rule. Of course, there are private camps that are more Hebrew rich than some of the other camps. This is a generalization, but I think it's a helpful generalization. The other thing that I think is helpful for us to understand is that when we went and we looked at these camps and we looked at what does Hebrew mean at these camps, what we found is that Hebrew is a flexible signifier, which means that it is open to multiple interpretations. So that for some camps, Hebrew might be a connection to Judaism. In other camps, Hebrew might be a connection to Israel and Zionism. In some camps, Hebrew just might be a special language that distinguishes camp space from space the rest of the year. And in a lot of camps, of course, it's more than one of these things. So Hebrew can mean different things. The other thing that we found that was ubiquitous at these camps is what we call camp Hebraized English. So you might think of this as, sort of sprinkling Hebrew words into English sentences. And when we're talking about the different kinds of words that can be sprinkled into English sentences, we're talking about Jewish life words, like you might hear mitzvah, or you might hear Shabbos, or something like that. But we're also talking about camp words. So, for example, you might hear the word chadar ochel. You might hear the word madrich, which means counselor, or pe'ula, which means activity, or tzrif, which means cabin. This is just an example of a Hebrew infused camp Hebraized English sentence that we heard at one of the more Hebrew-rich camps, madrichim, counselors, madrichot, female counselors. You know which chanikim or campers from your tzrifim or cabins need to take medications. After birkat hamazon, grace after meals, please go directly to the teatron for Pu'ulat Erev, theater for the evening activity. So that's an example of a Hebrew-rich, Camp Hebraized English sentence. We also what we also realized very, very quickly is that there's a process of Hebrew infusion. Camp Hebraized English is an example of Hebrew infusion. And maybe the best way to think about Hebrew infusion, certainly the way we were thinking about it, is the way that fruit is sometimes infused into water, and you get a taste of the fruit, but we're not talking about juice. There's a difference between drinking, let's say, juice and drinking a fruit-infused drink. So camp staff members will incorporate Hebrew elements into English, primarily through songs, signs, games, words, and as we said, through this process of Camp Hebraized English. And as we heard before, in terms of the flexible signifier, the goal of Hebrew infusion is really not to teach people how to speak Hebrew. It's not about Hebrew proficiency. It's really about identity. It's about Israel. It's about Jewish life. It's about strengthening your Jewish connection through camp. That's really what it's about. We did a survey and we were looking at the question of what kind of Hebrew-related practices one finds at camps. We found that all Jewish camps at least have some Hebrew blessings. Many use some Hebrew names for names of units or for activities. We found, though, that far fewer, although a sizable number, had Hebrew classes, and that even fewer were actually Hebrew immersion. So again, this just reinforces the idea that camps are doing this for reasons of proficiency, for connection, not for proficiency. We also asked the camps about the importance of why they were doing these things. And as you can see from this slide, people had a variety of different answers about why they were involved in these practices, but you can see that identity, connection to the Jewish people, connection to the state of Israel, scored much more highly than Hebrew proficiency. And we divided these different kinds of reasons into various categories. So we have the Jewish connection, which, as I said, scored most highly, Hebrew infusion, which scored sort of in the middle, and then Hebrew proficiency, which was, sort of on the lower end. I'm going to turn this over to Sarah for interests of time, but I will say, though, that if you want to talk about the history of Hebrew infusion, you really do need to go back and talk, first of all, about Camp Masad, which was a Hebrew-speaking camp that started in the 40s, and Camp Ramah, which was and is a conservative movement camp that tried to be a Hebrew-speaking camp, but over time really became more of a Hebrew-rich infusion camp. And what we found is that these two camps, as well as Zionist camps like Habonim and Young Judea, were really responsible for spreading Hebrew infusion to the larger camp community over time. And as I said, if I had more time, I would go into that some more, but I really want to make sure that we have time for Sarah to talk about supplementary schools. So take it away, Sarah.
Thank you, Jonathan. So I am happy to be presenting today on the two studies that I've been involved with recently, and I am going to do it in presenter mode because that's how I roll. So here's the study. It's a study that I conducted with my colleagues Netta Avineri and Nikki Greninger, and it was also funded by CASGE, and we called it Let's Stop Calling It Hebrew School, Rationales, Goals, and Practices of Hebrew Education in Part-Time Jewish Schools. And we did visit some schools and we did some interviews, but the primary tool for this study was a survey, it was multiple surveys. And one of the surveys was surveys of school directors. And we asked, what's being taught? Let me just make sure that I'm hiding my video panel so you can see this fully. Okay, so what are part-time Jewish schools teaching? Well, the Hebrew, when we look at the Hebrew related practices, we see that reciting prayers and decoding Hebrew are very common at part-time Jewish schools. These are mostly congregational schools, but also some independent ones. And Hebrew conversation was much rarer. So this really is similar to that other figure that you saw before about the various educational goals of camp. And how is Hebrew taught? Well, in various ways. We see that communal prayer and Jewish life vocabulary, games and fun activities and songs, which I would say are the infusion activities related to Hebrew, are very high, whereas the Hebrew immersion and elective-based Hebrew exposure are much lower down at the bottom. Now, Hebrew signs are used to some extent, and I think the reason that is much low, I think a lot of schools do have these signs, but it's lower in this figure because they don't do it frequently. You know, they might have just a few. But Hebrew through movement is a practice that is growing in popularity. And for those of you who don't know what it is a way of teaching some Hebrew through commands that the teacher says and the students do, and then sometimes the students say the commands as well. And so it's kinesthetic learning. And so I would say that is primarily a practice that is intended to actually teach some proficiency, but it has in common with the Hebrew infusion that it's fun and the kind of thing that you might expect in a more informal setting like a summer camp that has made its way throughout many part-time Jewish schools. So when we talk about Hebrew infusion, we're talking about songs, signs, using and teaching Jewish life vocabulary. And here is a picture from one of the schools that we visited where the Hebrew letter of the week was Yud that day. And they were talking about, it was probably around this time of year, actually. They were talking about Yisrael, Yom HaAtzmaut, and Yom Tov. And so again, you can see the infusion of Hebrew into a primarily English-speaking environment. Conversation and comprehension were less common. In fact, one teacher wrote, and by the way, we did the surveys of the school directors, but then we also did surveys of teachers, students, parents, and clergy. And we wanted to find out what their goals were and what their evaluations were of how their schools are doing with Hebrew. So one teacher wrote, modern conversational Hebrew is not the primary goal. The primary goal of our program is to educate the students in Hebrew that will allow them to pray with other Jews and to succeed at their bar and bat mitzvahs. Now, bar and bat mitzvah is really the prime motivator for many families to participate in Jewish education. And this causes tension. In fact, one educational leader said that bar and bat mitzvah is the third rail of Jewish education. I've heard it from many educators. It's the big obstacle, but it's also the big opportunity. Now, why is it the big opportunity? Because it brings people to school, and it is the prime motivator for participation. And why is it problematic? Well, because some people think that that's the only reason that parents want their kids to learn Hebrew or that kids want to learn Hebrew. So we asked about this. First, we asked, why are you interested in Hebrew? Is it for bar and bat mitzvah or for other reasons? And for each of those, we're presenting here the percentage of respondents in each category that said to a moderate or great extent. And this is among the 8 schools where we did follow-up studies after the overarching school director studies. And we found that the school directors indeed do value Hebrew for reasons other than bar and bat mitzvah more than for bar and bat mitzvah, and same with clergy, teachers about to the same extent, and parents do value Hebrew for bar and bat mitzvah more than for other reasons, and students much more than for other reasons. But it's not exactly as stark as the school directors think. So this one is a little confusing, so let me explain it. So the pink boxes here are what the parents rationales for bar and bat mitzvah for Hebrew use. And then the white boxes are the director's expectations of the parents' rationales. So what we see is that parents do value Hebrew for bar and bat mitzvah the most out of any of the other rationales. The other rationales are Hebrew is a language of the Jewish religion, the Jewish people, the state of Israel, and American Jewish life and culture. But the school directors think that the parents value Hebrew for bar and bat mitzvah much more than the other categories. Their expectations of what the parents value is much lower than what the parents actually respond. So then we asked about goals. We asked about a whole slew of goals that they might have for the Hebrew education at their school. And here's what we found. What you see here, the pink boxes are the parents, the blue are teachers, green are clergy, and the peach boxes are the school directors. And what we see is that recitation and decoding are much more important than comprehension, conversation, or writing. But affective goals like associating Hebrew with Jewishness and feeling personally connected to Hebrew are the most important goals for school directors, teachers, parents, students, and clergy. So for all of these groups, the affective goals are crucial. And that's something that I think we don't talk about enough. And this actually relates to what Jonathan was talking about before with the goals of infusion, that just like in camp, where the goal of infusion is fostering ideological links between the camper and the Hebrew language and various Jewish collectivities, the same is true here in part-time schools. The goal is for students to feel part of what my colleague Netta Avineri calls a meta-linguistic community, a community of people who value Hebrew, even if they can't have a full conversation in Hebrew. And so in this case, they might want the students to feel connected to the school or to American Jews or to the Jewish people or to Israel. And Hebrew is a way of feeling that connection. And finally, we see here that school directors express less interest in some modern Hebrew related goals than parents and other constituents. See how the peach boxes are lower here, especially in writing. And this perhaps reflects their more realistic sense of what is possible with limited contact hours. So we came up with a number of recommendations based on our findings. One, we recommend that schools encourage your community to stop calling it Hebrew school, except where Hebrew language proficiency is the primary focus, because calling it Hebrew school sets unrealistic expectations for what's going to actually happen in those schools. And yes, they will learn Hebrew, but the Hebrew that they will learn is just decoding and recitation and some themes of prayers, but they're not going to actually be able to have conversations in Hebrew. Second, engage in collaborative visioning with all stakeholders about Hebrew education, because it's possible that some people in the school actually, some families might really want that Hebrew conversation education. And if that happens, then it is possible that they could add a track, which I'll get to in a second. Then you should make students' connection to Hebrew an explicit goal and talk about the affective goals. Infuse more Hebrew through fun activities, songs, and signs, and focus on building a Hebrew metalinguistic community. When teaching decoding, we found that it's effective to spend less time in large groups and more time in one-on-one and small group configurations. And I think the pandemic, this was conducted before the pandemic, but I think the pandemic has led to more of that in online settings where people work one-on-one or small group over Zoom or FaceTime and that kind of thing. Also, with parent buy-in, consider offering a small amount of gamified homework, because the Hebrew education is more effective when there are more contact hours, and the limited contact hours were really one of the primary obstacles that people talked about in why the schools haven't been able to really focus much on Hebrew. And we found that a lot of people did talk about homework when it's fun being a game being more effective. And I know this is somewhat controversial because homework is hard. It's hard to get the families to do the homework. Another of the factors, the obstacles, is limited time and people not making their religious school as much of a priority as, say, soccer or theater or ballet or whatever it is they're doing, and of course regular school. But if the homework is a fun game, then maybe the students will be more likely to actually do it. And finally, for the schools to offer multiple tracks or an enrichment option for families that are interested in conversational Hebrew. And this, of course, depends on what we talked about up here, which is a collaborative visioning with stakeholders. And if you find that there aren't families at your school that want that, then of course you shouldn't offer it. In addition to these recommendations for the schools, we recommend that the nationwide and regional educational infrastructure, like Hebrew College, which does these kinds of professional development opportunities, and the umbrella organizations for the denominations and various BJE-like organizations in various cities, that these organizations should offer more funded online training for teachers and information sharing about Hebrew education, and also consulting and training for school directors. So just to conclude our overarching themes here, American Jewish summer camps and part-time schools have come up with fun, creative ways to infuse Hebrew into the primarily English environment. And over the years, camp leaders, we didn't really get into this, but they've debated how Hebrew should be used, and you saw some differences of opinion in how the part-time schools should use Hebrew. At most camps, connection is the primary driver for Hebrew use, and at most part-time schools, connection is important in addition to ritual participation and bar and bat mitzvah. And connection can be all of these constituencies here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, both Jonathan and Sarah. I think you did a phenomenal job in a short 20-ish minutes to really contextualize the studies, both studies, but also to give us sort of the launch pad and the jumping off point for the questions and the implications in our work. And we've had some nice little discussion coming through the chat already. I'm really struck. First of all, Sarah, thank you for your end there of acknowledging and underscoring that both camp and the part-time school settings have done a tremendous amount, obviously camps from the get-go, but part-time schools certainly in the last 20 or so years to make this Hebrew infusion fun. And certainly many of the schools that are represented here, I know many of your programs, and that fun component is there. But I love the way you framed sort of the recommendation to go for the gamification. I know that is something that a lot of schools are thinking about. We're going to open up for questions in a sec. So I know Robin had a hand up. I see Jerry's hand up. I just want to also frame the conversation. I love, Jonathan, how you structured it in this continuum, that it's not either or all or nothing. And I think that's true of our part-time schools as well. And I think for sure, the challenge for many of the part-time schools is the desire potentially to go the route of choice and options for students, but size does matter in that case. So the sort of being able to go along the continuum can become a challenge. So that was something I thought about. And I really would love to open it up to everybody. And this real question of our purposes in teaching Hebrew, our need and challenge of clarifying for our constituents what's doable and feasible and the difference between infusion and proficiency. So I really want to open it up. Robin, do you want to go, or and then I'll call on Jerry?
Sure. My question was, the slide that you said is confusing. Can you just go back? Is it possible, and explain that again? Because I think there were some implications, and I'm a director of education at a synagogue, and I thought there was a lot in there, and I was just trying to understand it better.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Robin.
Robin, that's the one you're talking about?
Yeah. So
Okay.
you're saying, yeah, can you, it sounds like the directors and the parents, you're saying don't necessarily see eye to eye on these.
Yeah, so well, this is the parents' rationales for why they're interested in Hebrew, and then the director's expectations of those parents' rationales. So the point here is that there's a disconnect in what the school directors think the parents think, right? So they think, oh, those parents, they're barely interested in Hebrew for other reasons besides bar and bat mitzvah prep. They're really just interested in bar and bat mitzvah, right? But what we find is that the parents are a little more interested than that, or a lot more really, in Hebrew as a language of the Jewish religion, and broader ritual participation, and in Hebrew as a language of the Jewish people and the state of Israel, less so in a language of American Jewish life and culture. But yeah, so that was the discrepancy there.
Okay. Thank you. That helps.
Thank you. Jerry.
I'm going to try really hard not to be one of those people who makes a really long comment and doesn't have a question. So I'm going to start with a minute of background, which is that I wrote my master's thesis at Hebrew College for my MJ Ed on small group Hebrew at the time in 2013, so 8 years ago. And it was just as Hebrew through movement was starting, so I didn't find out about it until after my thesis was written and published. But one of the things that I learned about language acquisition and natural language is that we learn language in terms of spoken language facility by first hearing it, which is receptive, then by responding, which is expressive, and then by learning things like reading and writing, which is productive. And the challenge that we have as Hebrew school educators or religious school directors and educators and clergy is that we do this backwards. And that's one of the things that Hebrew Through Movement tries to address, which is this idea that how can we get them to hear it, feel comfortable understanding it, learn to respond to it, and then learn to read and write it. And I think one of the other things that we do in religious school settings is we talk in terms of themes. So we learn that Baruch, Barhu, Hamvorach are all something to do with blessing. We try to attune their ears to some of the Shorashim like Bet Resh Chaf and Kuf Dalet Shin and Aleph Hey Vav Vet and things like that. So I hear some of this reflected in what you're reporting, and which was excellent, by the way. I really appreciated the way you structured it and also the way you presented it. But I'm curious about the use of TPR methods for teaching language, or creating even more of an environment, especially where some of our teachers are not comfortable in Hebrew. And so one of the things that I have been known to say to my teachers is, as long as you're a lesson or two ahead of the kids in teaching a prayer or teaching something, I have to be okay with that, because that's the environment that we're in terms of their facility and their knowledge. And they're teaching things that they probably can't translate with facility. So how do we manage all of these disparate goals? And I completely agree with you about shifting from religious school or Hebrew school to religious school, because I think it sets up a false expectation. And I also am passionate about Hebrew. I think that Hebrew is the love language between God and God's people. And so when we can create a love for that language, it strengthens Jewish identity, and it strengthens our ability to read Torah and learn and study and grow. So,
wow, thank you, Jerry. Wow. So at the end there, you said if we can create a love between these students and Hebrew. And that was what I was talking about with the affective goals, right? That should be an explicit goal of these part-time Jewish settings. And if it is an explicit goal, then there will be a sense that we are accomplishing our goals more than we currently feel we are, because that one of the impeti for this study was the understanding the ideology that schools are failing, that part-time Jewish schools are failing in Hebrew education. Why? It is because it's because of unrealistic expectations and goals, right? That if the goal is for students to become proficient in Hebrew, that is an unrealistic goal in just a few hours a week. And we found that the average number of hours that the schools spend on Hebrew per week was something like 1.9 or something like that. And that is, it's just impossible to teach any language in that short amount of time, especially when there's spotty attendance and when the schools don't even meet year round, right? So, and of course they could send them to camps over the summer that have a little more Hebrew, but there isn't a coordinated effort like that in most cases. And then your question about, wait, you had a few questions there. I think your total physical response. Yes, that is a very important aspect of Onward Hebrew, and I recommend, if you're not familiar with Onward Hebrew, to take a look at their website later, and they have some wonderful research-based expectations or recommendations about how to teach Hebrew, and Hebrew Through Movement, which is the Hebrew version of Total Physical Response, is central there. So I recommend that.
I'll just tag on and say that while I am not necessarily the person who recommends making school into camp, I think that there's a difference between school and camp. I think that both settings can learn from each other. I think that camp does do, though, a good job at precisely what Jerry was talking about before, which is really emphasize both the oral and the oral, that is the hearing and the speaking of Hebrew, as the first step, really. And in some ways, camp doesn't sometimes get to the reading and the writing because it's camp. But a lot of the techniques that are used, like the songs, the games, things like that, that are really embedded into camp life, I think those things do translate really well. I understand that there might be resistance from parents who want to see, kids decoding and stuff like that. I even have a story in my earlier book, The Benderly Boys, about a teacher, and this is 50 years ago, 60 years ago, who decided, first grade teacher who decided that they would take away all of the books and everything and just focus on the speaking and just focus on using manipulatives and things like that and pictures, and the parents rebelled against it, even though the kids, I think, were probably learning a lot because it didn't look like school. So I totally, my heart goes out to you guys on that level, but I think that you have to fight the good fight. I really do.
Great, thank you. I think the other point that Jerry brought, thank you both, Sarah and Jonathan, for your responses, and Jerry, thank you for the rich question. I think the other piece that you brought up that piqued my curiosity and interest, and you'll all appreciate this, is when you said about, telling your teachers to stay just two weeks ahead. And of course, sort of what kind of environment do we create for our teachers? Our role as educators extend to what we do for our teachers. And obviously for some of us, we have, trained and experienced teachers, and some of us rely on those kids that come through camp, through that experience, and into the colleges, and then as college students become our teachers. So just something to keep in the hopper. I'd love to have Alana's voice in this, of course, from Kesher, which comes at this from a very more hours, thank God, and a very different ideological approach. So Kesher, Alana, go ahead.
Thanks, Marianne. We try. So Varian said, we are doing conversational Hebrew through the proficiency approach. I still have that struggle with parents. They want them to read, they want them to decode, they still want a bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, at the end of it. So we definitely have that push and pull. My question is about staffing, and Marian started to allude to it also, and Jerry as well. I've had a push to try to hire more and more native speakers. And the funny thing is often my native speakers are the ones that speak the most English with the kids because it's easier. If I have and I've tried to do training in the proficiency approach, and you really need to get the buy-in from the teachers to understand what it means to speak to the kids only in Hebrew. So I started sometimes hiring people with pretty good Hebrew or like okay Hebrew, but like with enough Hebrew, but with the passion and the desire to speak Hebrew to the kids. So I'm curious, in your research in camps and schools, is there discussion about native speakers versus just proficient speakers and the training that you do for those teachers?
Well, I'll actually start for a minute and then hand it over to Sarah. But one of the things that came up in our book research was shlichim, and how shlichim or emissaries from Israel have become very popular at summer camps. But the shlichim are not necessarily in their minds there to teach kids Hebrew. They're often there to make kids want to love Israel. And they often see the language barrier as a impediment to creating a sense of connection with the kids. And so they'll speak in English to the kids. And it's really frustrating to some like camp directors who think that this shaliach is going to be like the Hebrew infusion into the camp. And in fact, the shaliach is resistant to speaking in Hebrew for precisely, I think, the reason, Alana, that you were talking about before. Sarah, did you find that also with supplementary schools?
Yeah, in an interesting way, actually. Well, we did find that, but we also found sort of the converse or inverse of that, which is that some American teachers in part-time schools and not in a place like Kesher, which is much more focused on immersion, were felt like they had inauthentic Hebrew, that they would turn to the native speaking Israelis for certain things. And an example is a man who said, well, I know I'm not pronouncing charoset quite right, so let me show you how the native speaker does it. And then charoset, and that's so interesting. That's something we sort of argue against in our book, and not in the part-time school study as much, but I would argue that American Jewish Hebrew use is an authentic type of Hebrew. We don't have to strive for the Israeli accent. We are creating, throughout history, Jews have pronounced Hebrew and written Hebrew in ways that are heavily influenced by their local languages. And so why not for American Jews? Well, the answer is because now we have the state of Israel and we have Hebrew as a vernacular there, and that serves as a model in a way that it never could have before. But I think, so it's an interesting tension there between, should we be teaching Hebrew as it's used in Israel, or should we be teaching Hebrew as an American phenomenon?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is to get the buy-in from the teacher, regardless of whether the teacher is Israeli or American or South American or South African or wherever they come from. As long as the teacher's ideologically on the same page as the director, and that that they aren't at cross purposes. That's the most important thing.
Thank you. I'm watching the time, and I have to profusely apologize to, I assume it's Marcy and Itzi from YJ who just joined on. When I sent the first reminder to the camp directors, I had the time wrong, and I did change it, but I guess I didn't remind you enough that I changed it. So Marcy and Yitzi, if you're on there, hello, but we're going to be wrapping up, but the recording will be available. So everybody else also, I know, thanks, Itzy, I see he just answered. I want to be respectful of everybody's time, in particular, of course, Sarah and Jonathan. And I don't know if anybody caught this, but Sarah's on the West Coast. She woke up very early to share with us and be so present and so energetic and coherent at this hour. So really, really appreciated. So yes, big kudos. So I do want to, such a rich conversation, something that really pulls at all of our professional heartstrings and our personal emotional ones, because as Jerry said, it is the love language of God and the Jewish people, and it's our love language amongst ourselves, I think, as well. There's something very beautiful about where we bring Hebrew and how we use Hebrew and how it helps us identify and have our, our secret code, so to speak. So something to really continue to think about. I did put the link in the chat to both the little promo about the Hebrew Infusion book, but also to the study that Sarah alluded to about Hebrew in the part-time schools that Kashji put out. I just want to be respectful of the time and just can't thank Jonathan and Sarah enough for helping bring us deep into this conversation in such an efficient and effective way in this Zoom world that we're in. And of course, both of them are, we're part of the same mishpacha or mishpacha, and we can all always connect with each other and have these deeper conversations, and certainly to connect to Jonathan and Sarah through their research and using their book, possibly with your families and with your staff as a way to identify how do you all have the same goals and the same zeitgeist that you want to create inside your schools. So kol hakavod, thank you everybody.
You should feel free to Google me. You'll find my address at Brandeis. You can always contact me. I'm happy to speak with practitioners, yeah, so feel free to reach out.
Great.
Me too.
Thank you so much. And God willing, in not too distant future, maybe we'll be schmoozing on the Brandeis campus or on the Hebrew College campus together, B'karov b'yameinu. So thank you, everybody. Good to see you all this morning. And I will be posting the recording, so you can certainly share this with your lay leaders, with your staff. And also just a reminder, our concluding session of this year, of this academic year, is on May 24th, I think is the date. It's the Monday of that week. And I'll be, Miriam Hella-Stern will be our guest, and she'll be talking about creativity. So thank you all for your time this morning. Really good to be together. Thank you.